I created this short video to briefly explain how the IRS looks at the stimulus payments paid in 2020 and 2021 from a tax perspective, as well as recap each payment and how you can ensure you're receiving stimulus payments you qualify for. The IRS refers to stimulus payments as actually economic impact payments. This is important if you're trying to fill out the worksheet to determine an amount on your return. They don't call them stimulus payments. Let's quickly recap each of the payments that have been approved by Congress in 2020 and 2021. Then we'll discuss how these impact a tax return. So the first economic impact payment allowed for taxpayers to receive a payment at $1,200 per person. If you were filing a return married, filing jointly, it was actually $2,400. And to the extent you had qualifying children, you also got a $500 payment for each of those children. Second economic impact payment was approved later in 2020, and in that payment, there was a $600 payment per person or $1,200 if they were married filing jointly. In this payment, additionally, if you had a qualifying child, this time the payment for each qualifying child was $600. These were two separate payments, and if you qualified, you could get both of them. Now, under these payments, not everybody qualified. There was a phase out, and the phase out was based on your adjusted gross income, which on your tax return is all of your gross income less some deductions. If your adjusted gross income was above $150,000 and you were married filing jointly, then there was a phase out that actually reduced the amount of payment that you received. Head of household, the amount was a little bit less, $112,500. And if you were single or married filing separately, the phase out started at $75,000. Of course, 2020 tax returns were not filed until now. People are starting to file them. So they used your 2019 or 2018 tax return to determine whether or not you could qualify for a payment as a way to get people their payments as fast as possible during 2020. A third economic impact payment was just approved at the beginning of 2021. That economic impact payment is actually $1,400 per person or $2,800 if you're married filing jointly, and the amount per dependent is $1,400. This was a little bit different. Instead of a qualifying child, the payments were determined based on the number of dependents in your household. This is again another additional payment that is going to be paid out, which is why it's slightly different colored here on this slide than before. There's also a difference in the amount of the threshold for phase out. So it starts at the same amount of gross income, but it phases out much quicker. So if you make more than the threshold, it is possible that you might be phased out of this at a much lower amount than you would have in economic payment 1 or 2. So there are people who may have gotten partial payments for 1 and 2 and may not get anything, or a much smaller payment in number 3, even though the total amounts being given out are more. So these payments are actually prepayments with regards to your 2020 tax return. What do I mean by that? They were actually put into legislation as a rebate credit. They are a recovery rebate credit that when you're doing your 2020 tax return would be in addition to things like the earned income credit or the child tax credit. They wanted those payments to come out early, so the IRS made prepayments, and the thought was that when you go to do your 2020 tax return, you would true up the amount of payment you received by doing a credit calculation. The calculation is not in the form at all. It's in the instructions to the form if you want to work through a worksheet, but the value of the credit is actually on Form 1040, that's your individual tax return, page 2. You can see it on row 30. So if you did not receive a payment in the past, you still may qualify to get one, and it would be in the form of a credit against the amount of taxes you've owed. The key here is, though, the fact that this is actually a credit and not an income means that your stimulus payments are not included as income and taxable. So you do not need to pay taxes on them or include them in your 2020 or 2021 gross income. They are a prepayment of a credit that you're, in other words, qualifying for on your return. So let's kind of talk about what happened if the credit is different than what you got as an economic impact payment earlier on. So if you received the full economic impact payment for number 1 and number 2 and you fully qualified for them, then your 2020 tax return will show only a recovery rebate credit for number 3. So there should be nothing that would end up as an extra credit on your return with respect to number 1 and number 2. If you received less than the full economic impact payment, number 1 and number 2, then on your 2020 tax return, you'll do a worksheet, and that will show a recovery rebate credit for payment number 1 and number 2 and number 3, less any payments you already received. So let's say you had received $1,000 total between economic impact payment 1 and economic payment 2, but you qualified for several $1,000s, it will just reduce the amount of credit for the check that you already received in the mail. So you're not getting paid anything beyond the total of what those payouts were. If you received the full economic impact payment, number 1 and 2, and you should not have, so it ends up when you do your 2020 tax return, you were able to have more adjusted gross income than anticipated, more than 19, and you really shouldn't have to, good news. The IRS says you don't have to pay back the difference. So there's no way for them to go back and collect. It just means you're not getting anything more on your 2020 tax return. And then finally, if you didn't receive an economic impact payment, 1 or 2 or both, but you qualify, then what's going to happen is when you do your 2020 tax return, you will get a full recovery rebate credit on that return for those payments. And then the third payment would also be included. So I think a lot of people are probably saying, what happens when I get my checks if I did my 2020 tax return, I already filled it out, and I didn't fill it out correctly? The IRS website in March just published, do not file an amended tax return if you entered an incorrect amount for the 2020 recovery rebate credit on your tax return. If you entered an amount on line 30 but made a mistake in calculating the amount, the IRS will calculate the correct amount of the rebate for you and make the correction to your tax return. They'll continue processing your return. So hopefully this video provides you with a better understanding as to how the recently enacted stimulus payments impact your personal tax return. If you found this video useful, subscribe to receive updates on additional videos published on personal finance tax issues.